Croeso, Fulcha, Dinach, Fulcha Ort, Daymat. Welcome to the Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. My name is Sian Esther Powell, and I'll be taking you on a journey through all the myths and legends of the 6 Celtic nations. So that's Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, Brittany, and the Isle of Man. Hello everyone, my microphone keeps malfunctioning, but I make do with what I have. Super excited for this episode. I know I say that for every episode, but I think this one is going to be really cool. I've been, doing a lot of reading and research about various things, and I think it's going to come together really nicely. And yeah, here goes. So today's episode, as you well know if you've listened to past episodes, I focus on one of the Celtic nations every episode. I don't know if that's something I'm going to keep doing in the future, maybe. So today we're focusing on the city of Ys. It's a drowned city, but then I thought, gosh, there's loads of different drowned cities and lost lands and sunken kingdoms. Try and say that 3 times. Sunken kingdoms, sunken kingdoms, sunken kingdoms. It's not the easiest. There you go. That's the new tongue twister for the hour. Sunken kingdoms. So there's a lot of these phenomena in Celtic myths. You have lots of drowned lands in Welsh mythology, and you also have the lost land of Lioness in Cornish or Arthurian legend. So I thought we'll do the focus on the city of Ys, but we'll also bring in some other drowned cities as well and make this a nice rounded out episode. So it's going to be wicked, really excited. Before I get really stuck in, I thought I better say a big thank you to all my Patreons. You're amazing. So that is a big thank you to Alex, Blythe, Celtic Myths Pod Show, another brilliant show that you really need to listen to. David, James, Keely, Kimberly, Lynn, Pamela, Patrick, River and Simon. Thank you so much. You guys are wicked. Really appreciate your support. Of course, I often say it, I don't want anyone to ever feel pressured to be a patron of this show. I'm never going to deny you content. So what I'm going to introduce is 5-minute episodes for my $5 patrons. So what that means is those patrons will get those episodes first. They will be able to choose a subject that interests them, so I will make the subject specifically for them and they will receive that episode first. But then at a later date, I will compile these 5-minute mini episodes into a bonus episode that I will release onto the show for everyone to enjoy. So I feel like I'm being the most fair that I can be with that. Hopefully you all agree. And for those of you who aren't aware of what Patreon is, essentially it's a platform where creators can have money pledged to them per month or per creation. So basically a patron of my show can pledge $1, $3 or $5 every single time I upload an episode. Luckily for you guys, that isn't too often. I'm averaging about every few months. My goal is to release 12 episodes before December comes along, or before the end of the year, because then that means that when my podcast turns 2 years old, this December, I will have averaged about an episode every 2 months, which makes me feel a little bit less bad, a little bit less guilty. But you can find me on Patreon just under Celtic Myths and Legends podcast, which brings me to my next point. I'm going to just do a quick rundown of all the places where you can find this podcast. So you can find this podcast on Facebook. Obviously, if you just type in Celtic Myths and Legends podcast. You can also find this podcast on Twitter. Not to be confused with the wonderful Celtic Myths Pod Show. We have very similar handles, but my handle on Twitter is Celtic Myths Pod. So you should be able to find me on there. I often post polls and little posts and relevant things about the podcast. I ask what people are interested in. I let you know what I'm working on. So they are good things to kind of follow if you're on Facebook and Twitter. So give me a follow on there. Thank you very much. Other than that, you can email the podcast. I always get this wrong, so bear with me one moment. You know, if I was a professional, I would just pause this right now and look, but instead I'm just looking on my phone as I speak. So there we go. You can contact me at celticmythspodcast@outlook.com. I always say .co.uk, but it's not. So celticmythspodcast@outlook.com if you want to email me an inquiry or just to let me know that you're enjoying the show. That really does make me so happy when people do that. So thank you so much. It's dawned on me recently the amount of people who actually are excited about this podcast, who do tune in to new episodes, who are, you know, sending me messages thanking me. And don't worry, it won't ever get to my head. I'm just chuffed that anyone is listening to it, let alone what seems like quite a few people at this point. So bless you all. Thank you so much. If it seems like I'm shouting, I think I probably am a little bit. I'm actually currently reclining in my chair at the height of decadence right now, and I'm not quite sure how well my voice travels across over to my microphone. Where I work at the moment, part of my job is doing little tours, being a bit of a tour guide. I don't know why I say bit of a tour guide, you know, it is the whole me. I'm not just sending out my arm to give tours. So I'm a whole tour guide. And I remember asking one time if everyone in the group could hear me. And because where I work is an island, it's a tidal island, I remember a gentleman kindly retorted with, "They can hear you over in the mainland." So I don't think he was meant to compliment me, but actually I did find that quite complimentary and secretly was very pleased. I'm sure you can imagine my tours are absolutely professional and absolutely never include any jokes or laughter whatsoever. No fun allowed when you have history to learn. Now I guess we better get into the actual meat of the podcast. Okay, let's go. So, the city of Ys. What a brilliant myth this is. And not only because there are parallels to other myths as well, but I love this one for a number of reasons. One, the idea of ancestral memory playing a part in lost lands, and also the kind of Christian or religious moral coding that you can find in this myth as well. So, to get to the basics, the city of Ys was a beautiful, rich, thriving city in off the coast of Brittany. So in the original Breton, I believe it was named as Caer Ys. So that's actually quite similar to the Welsh word Caer as well, which kind of translates as stronghold, fortress, citadel, that kind of thing, which is wicked because you can see that in The Witcher as well. If you've ever played The Witcher, you'll have noticed tons of little Celtic myths and myths from other places as well, sprinkled in that game. I haven't read the books, I will admit that, and I must read the books, but the games are absolutely phenomenal and I love them, and they're absolutely filled with little references like that. So Caer Ys, or we're just going to go with Ys, city of Ys. Interestingly enough, sorry, I don't know if you had that banging outside. I think that was my rabbit. It's been raining all day, so he's, you know, nice and snug in his hutch. And might I add that his hutch actually has stairs in it, so he has a very luxurious place to live. So I don't know what he's banging on about, okay? So on to Ys. Interestingly enough, Paris means like Ys. So I think that's really, really cool. So that's how old and established Ys is in Breton folklore and mythology and general kind of consciousness. So the actual practical building of Ys is quite interesting. So it seemed to have been built below sea level, or on land kind of reclaimed from the sea. So in that regard, when it gets to high tide, that is not a very safe place to live. So a dike was built around the city, and huge gates were put around the city to fortify it and to protect it from the sea. So at low tide, the gates can be opened and ships can come to port and people can visit the city of Ys. But at high tide, or mid tide as well, the gates are closed to protect the people within the city and to protect the city itself. So the drowning of Ys is quite a tragic myth in some ways, because, you know, it was a city of splendour and beauty. You know, it was a cultural city. It had marble and cedar and gold and all these wonderful, beautiful materials, you know, palaces, people dancing, singing, drinking, merriment, having fun. And that is actually part of the downfall of the city itself. So there are lots of different versions of the myth, you know, written in poems, in manuscripts that have been kind of adapted and changed throughout the years, but the common thread is that King Gradlong was a former pagan warrior. He was used to be a kind of naval warrior as well. He always loved the sea. He travelled on the sea, and he was the king of Ys. He founded Ys, or in some myths, he was the last king of Ys. So in some myths, he founded it, he created it, which means that it had a very kind of short lifetime. It wasn't a very old city, but in some myths, he is the last king of the city. So King Gradlong is the king of Ys, and his daughter is Dayut. And Dayut is kind of seen as a very promiscuous woman. She drinks a lot, she dances, she has a lot of one-night stands, and in some versions of the myth, she actually kills her partner. So she often gives her partners a black mask, and in some kind of game she asks them to put on the mask, and then kind of spikes come out of it, or something comes out of this black mask that's really kind of horrible and gruesome and quite American Horror Story like, to be honest with you, and it kills her suitor for the evening, to put it nicely. So she isn't seen as a very moral or Christian character. I actually think she's a really interesting character, because in some versions of the myth, she is quite horrible. You know, she is murderous, she is scheming, she is a little bit stupid, because she trusts, well, I'll get into that bit of the myth a little bit later. But there are elements of her character that I think today, for women today, are actually, you know, not terrible. You know, she likes to dance naked, or she likes to swim naked in the waters outside the city of Ys at low tide when it's safe. She's a very kind of natural and spiritual woman, in the fact that she loves the sea. She feels very connected to the sea, which ties into her fate later on in the myth. So in some ways, she is horrible, she is a negative character, she isn't a role model. But in other ways, it's interesting to see that in the past, this kind of woman was vilified, was the worst kind of woman, someone that was very natural, someone that was very confident in their sexuality, you know, a woman that was sexual, a woman that was present and wasn't hidden away, that did show her body, that, you know, did embrace her body. And it's interesting that women like this now are not quite as vilified and not seen as, you know, as totally evil. Don't get me wrong, I wouldn't recommend to the young girls of today to start killing off your one night stands with black masks filled with spikes. Probably not a very pleasant idea. I'm absolutely not an advocate for it, but I do think there is an interesting kind of shift in the way that we view being connected to nature today, being kind of spiritual in that way. That was a bit of a tangent there, sorry about that. So in most versions of the myth, Dayut is very decadent. She lives a very kind of decadent life. She drinks a lot. She sleeps with a lot of men that she often kills, as I've mentioned. And one day, a knight with a red beard kind of enters the city of Ys and captures her fancy. So, he's very handsome, he's very charming, and for once she sees a man that not only does she want to spend the night with once, but actually, she doesn't pull out the whole black mask, trick on him. So she spends the night with the Red Knight, who's very manipulative of her, who knows that he has cast a kind of spell over her, and he convinces her to open the gates of the city. So as I mentioned, the city of Ys has great gates built around it to protect it when it is high tide. So there is only a portion of time when it's low tide when the city gates can be open, when it is safe for them to be open in that way. So the only person who has access to the keys of these gates, and also the dyke keys, is King Gradlon. So King Gradlon loves his daughter. He cherishes his daughter as he once cherished her mother. So it isn't entirely clear who Dayut's mother was. In some versions of the myth, we understand that she was a red-haired lady who Gradlon met on his many adventures on the sea. She was married to an older gentleman in some myths, and Gradlon helps to kind of do away with him. That's often the case in these myths, isn't it, to be honest? These poor old men getting offed by their beautiful young wives and their suitors. But there we go. So, but it's not a permanent marriage. It's not a permanent union. So Gradlon and this woman were very much in love, but she tells him at one point, in some versions of the myth, she dies when she gives birth to Dayut, but in some versions of the myth, she tells him that Dayut will grow up to bear a great resemblance to her, so that she will carry her face, so that Gradlon will never forget her, but when they next see a bit of land, an island, to leave her there and to carry on with his destiny and his adventures. So that's what he does. Like I said, in some versions of the myth she dies. In other versions of the myth they come across an island. He leaves her on the island because she foretold, if we don't come across this island and you don't leave me there, we will never see land again. So he leaves her there and he carries on with his life, and he gets to Ys, where he raises Dayut and he loves her. So it's because of this pure love that he has for his daughter that he ignores her vices for so long. He ignores all of the corruption that she is apparently bringing to the city. But I find it quite an interesting kind of tidbit that a part of the reason why Ys is so rich and culturally kind of resplendent is possibly the fact that Dayut was a pagan. She was known to be a pagan, so Ys became a safe haven for pagans. So in some ways the city was so cultural and so diverse and so rich with artistic splendour because all the pagans were there. No, I'm just joking. Well, I'm not really joking, but there we go. So it has some really interesting religious kind of undertones to this myth. I'll get to the whole moral bit later on. So essentially, a red knight comes to Dayut and he's very charming and he's flirting with her and he's saying, if to prove your love to me, if you love me, you will take the keys from your father and you will open up the gates of the city. So in some versions of the myth, Dayut is drunk. She's drunk with actual alcohol, but she's also drunk with love as well. So she does take the keys from the gate, and she does open it. In some versions of the myth, the Red Knight opens it himself. She gives him the keys and he opens it. But who does the Red Knight turn out to be? None other than the devil himself. The goat of Mendes, the devil himself. So yes, he is the actual devil. And he opens up the gates, or he commands, or persuades, or coerces Daiut to open up the gates, and the city is flooded. So the city of Ys is completely flooded and destroyed, and as this is happening, Gradlon wakes up, and he's panicking, and he has a magical horse. I forgot to tell you, he has a magical horse that can ride on the sea. So he has a magical horse, and as he's galloping through the city, through on top of the waves, he spies his daughter, grabs his daughter, and puts her on the back of his horse. But as he is escaping the city, his horse is kind of drowning. He isn't able to ride on the waves. I believe the horse is called Morvac, which is a pretty badass sounding name. Morvac cannot ride above the waves, and it is a saint, I can't pronounce his name, a Saint Gwenolo, it's kind of different in different myths, who commands Gradlon to cast off the devil at his back. And of course, the devil at his back is his own daughter, Daiut. So at first, obviously he's very hesitant. He doesn't want to throw his daughter back into the ocean. He's like, nah, mate, I don't think I'll do that. And then the saint is like, no, you really have to do that. She's the one that brought this mayhem to the city. She opened the city gates. It's flooding because of her. Your horse is drowning. Your magical horse dude that is supposed to ride the waves isn't riding the waves. I wonder why. So eventually he does cast off his daughter. In some versions of the myth, it's the saint that knocks her off and she falls into the ocean. But in some versions of the myth, Gradlon really does just go, yeah, you know what, fair enough, you make some good points, and throws his daughter into the ocean and escapes the drowning of the city of Ys. So what happens to Daiut? I find it so interesting. So she gets transformed into a Morgan, into a sea Morgan, which is a mermaid type creature who lures men and sailors onto rocks and to their deaths in the ocean. So she was always a woman, a character that was very in touch with the ocean, that was very, that seemed very part of the ocean. Perhaps it was because her mother seemed to be almost vaguely supernatural and came from the ocean. Who knows? Not really clear on that. But she loved the sea. So it's interesting to think whether her transformation and a metamorphosis into a Morgan is a punishment for her crimes, or whether it is just the next step in the evolution of her character. See, I don't know if she is being punished for this when you really think about it, because obviously authors of the stories and the myths and people who are adapting the myths will have much different ideas. They probably think getting transformed into a man-killing sea witch is a terrible fate, but I don't know, it probably suits her quite well, to be honest. So I think it's more like a reward for her, really. But I do find Morgans very interesting creatures in their own right anyway. They exist in Welsh mythology as well, so you do see a lot of parallels with Breton and Welsh folklore and mythology, and to a lesser extent Cornish as well. Actually, no, scratch that, not to a lesser extent. Cornwall and Brittany share a lot of folkloric features. I'm going to do this for my friend Jay. My friend Jay is always asking about Correds. And it was Correds that helped Daiut build the city of Ys. Or not build, helped Daiut to make the city of Ys what it was in terms of its decadence and splendour. Corred or Corrigan is the more common term. I think Corred is more a fantasy Dungeons and Dragons term. But he's always asking me to mention Correds, so there you go. I will mention Corrigans in a better episode, not a better episode. I'll mention Corrigans better in another episode. I don't know what I'm saying. All I'm saying is I will talk about Corrigans again at greater length, in greater depth also. So there we have it. That is the myth of the drowning of the city of Ys. And it interests me in particular because I love the idea of lost lands, drowned cities, like I said, sunken kingdoms. This type of phenomena is found in almost every culture, the idea of floods and deluges and lost cities lost to water. And I find it absolutely fascinating because not only is it quite a tragic and romantic idea in and of itself, it is also one that can be connected or attributed to many different things. My favourite theory being one of ancestral memory. So, for example, where I currently work at the moment, I work at St. Michael's Mount. So you might have heard me mention that before in the Giants of Cornwall episode. That was before I worked there, interestingly enough. But it's a really wicked, cool place. I say wicked in positive terms, not wicked as in, like, you know, Disney villain witch terms. It's a very interesting historical place, but is also a place that has existed in myth and legend as well. So the Cornish name for St. Michael's Mount is Carreg Lucan Cws, which means grey rock in the woods, because although now it is a tidal island that is connected to the causeway at low tide by connected to the mainland at low tide by a man-made causeway, it is also now an island. It is a tidal island, but it didn't used to be. It used to be something like 8 miles inland from the shore, which is fascinating. And I'm not telling anyone to ever go out and do this, but at very, very low spring tides, this is incredibly rare that this has happened, but it has happened. At very low spring tides, the remains of a petrified forest that is something like 5,000 years old has been spied on various beaches in the area surrounding Mounts Bay, surrounding St. Michael's Mount. And I think that is so fascinating because that kind of calls into question the Cornish name for St. Michael's Mount and whether that is an astonishing example of ancestral memory. Carreg Lucan Cws, the grey rock in the wood, because this is something that, you know, thousands of years ago it might have been 8 miles inland from the shore. It would have always been a mount, kind of a hill fort on a hill fort on a hill, there you go. But it didn't used to always be water surrounding the mount. It would have been forest. So I find that so cool and interesting, this idea of changing geographic landscapes and features. And of course, part of the reason why we have certain myths and legends about lost lands and about particular landscape features is because they were different in the past, and people remember them differently through the past, not through their own personal memories, but through ancestral memories, through the passing down of knowledge from generation to generation, much like folklore itself. So you have these places that, due to glaciers or flooding or any other sort of big kind of natural change, the landscape has changed over the years. You know, thousands of years ago, Britain and the British Isles did not look like how it looks today. And I love the fact that loads of folklore is connected to that, is connected to this idea of ancestral memory that remembers a time when the landscape looked different. Whew, again, another tangent. I'm getting really heated about that, or more excited. I just find it so cool, so interesting. Also, those of you who aren't aware, I'm going to just insert some newly found knowledge that I have about tides. That's another reason why I wanted to cover drowned cities, because working on a tidal island, you know, you find all these bits of information that you have to start learning about the sea and tides. So spring tides are the type of tides that have the biggest variance. So it means that low tides are very low and high tides are very high, and neap tides are where there is much less of a variance. So the lower tides and the higher tides don't have that much of a difference between them, not anything like spring tides do, and these alternate weekly. So 1 week a neap tide, 1 week a spring tide. or it's that kind of thing anyway. So I'm assuming that the devil in the myth of the drowning of the city of Ys, I'm assuming that the devil kind of picked a time when it was spring tides and he could cause the most disastrous events as possible. Oh, this is a delicious tidbit. I love it, actually, because it's so wicked. And now I do mean wicked in the Disney witch kind of sense. The wicked. In one of the versions of the myth, Gradlon looks back on his magical horse after he's cast off Diute. He looks behind him and the devil is there swinging his keys, just like giggling to himself, just being all mischievous, like, ha ha ha, look what I've done to your city, ha ha, just swinging his keys. And I love that because that is so devilish, so wicked, and also quite funny in a way. So there you go. That is the city of Ys, which brings me on to another myth of a drowned land, of a drowned kingdom. And now we're going to move over to Wales briefly. And then we're going to probably cover the Lost Land of Lyonesse a little bit, because I would be absolutely criminal being Cornish if I didn't talk about the Lost Land of Lyonesse in this episode. So, on to Wales. I mean, I am also Welsh other than Cornish, so I'm equally as excited to talk about the Welsh myths as well. That's one thing that I find interesting. Sometimes I do listen back to my podcasts, not a lot. The sound of your own voice is always a little bit jarring and strange. And my accent, it changes a lot. There are times when I feel like I do have a bit of a Welsh accent. There are times when I feel like I have a bit of a Cornish accent. And there are times when I feel like I just have a standard, boring RP English accent. It changes like the tides, you could say. That's very self-indulgent, so I'm going to nip that in the bud. But there we go, just to explain in case anyone's ever like, this girl sounds different sometimes. What is that about? Now you know. It just changes, I guess. It always has, and probably always will. It is interesting to me that the Celts, and I do say that term very loosely and in a very general umbrella sense, because as I have said in detail before, there was never one monolithic Celtic nation, so that's why there was never one pantheon of Celtic gods, as you get with Norse gods and Roman and Greek gods. There was never a pantheon of Celtic gods. There was never a coherent collection of Celtic myths that was at the time seen as Celtic. You had, various tribes and various groupings of people who in hindsight we have seen have many similarities. But saying that, the Celts do seem to love a good water myth. I won't go into detail about the other world, Tir na Nog and all things like that, because technically they don't have part of the myth doesn't include a flood, so I'm really only talking about flooding and myths that include kind of water and inundation right now, because the otherworld myths, the Celts seem to love the idea of the otherworld existing underneath bodies of water. So water seems very important, and I guess that makes complete sense because Britain and the British Isles are isles, they are islands, and there are Cornwall, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, all have a lot of coastline, as do the rest of the world that is on the sea. But there we go. There's a lot of coastline in the UK, so it makes sense that there are a lot of water myths and why islands in particular hold a kind of special magic and importance about them, especially if islands once existed where they do not exist now because of rising sea levels. Again, that change in the landscape, which I find fascinating to be a kind of explanation for lots of different folklore and myths. Okay, a tangent aside, we will go on to Wales now. There are quite a few drowned lost city myths in Wales, one of which is the Lowland Hundred, or the Cantref Gwaelod. It has been called the Welsh Atlantis, and it's featured in lots of different songs and folklore and myths and legends. It occupied what is now an area of Cardigan Bay in Wales, and I think it's because it's really romantic to have an idea of a lost city. You often find it with these myths that there is folklore associated with it, that mentions the sound of church bells ringing underneath the sea or ringing beneath the water. You get that in the city of Is. You get that in the Lost Land of Lyonesse, and you get that with the Cantref Gwaelod as well. This idea that you can still hear the church bells ringing beneath the water. It's, you know, it is a very romantic image, isn't it? And it makes me wonder if there's like a common sea sound that just makes fishermen and boatmen think of church bells. I don't know, but there has to be some kind of grain, some kind of tiny little grain in all of these pieces of folklore and folk history. Some kind of bit of truth and explanation to them. That's what I think anyway. And much like the drowning of the city of Is, there are lots of different versions of this myth as well. Arguably, one of the oldest is found in the Black Book of Carmarthen, where this land was originally called Maes Gwyddno, the Plain of Gwyddno. It was said to have been laying under the waters of what is now Cardigan Bay, as I said. And again, it starts off with a woman. It starts off with a young woman, a well maiden, who neglects to complete her tasks and her duties, overseeing and looking after the well. And the well overfloods and it floods the land, and then we get our sunken kingdom, the Lowland Hundred. Now, Gwyddno was the name of the ruler of this land, if you're going to go by the Black Book of Carmarthen version with the Plain of Gwyddno, Maes Gwyddno. Now, I thought that this would make a great companion piece to the city of Is, because in the most well-known version of the myth now, it was also a kind of fortified citadel or kingdom that had gates around the outside of it that protected the city against the sea. So it was very lowland, hence the name Lowland Hundred. So it was very lowland against the sea, and it had gates and dikes to protect it from the sea, much like the city of Is. And in some versions of the myth, as I said, it's a well maiden who neglects her duties. But in other versions of the myth, there are two princes or two rulers of this kingdom. So you have Seithenyn and Gwyddno. So Seithenyn is a drunkard. He's very... He, much like the well maiden, probably neglects to do his duties very well. He's drunk, and through his sheer carelessness opens up the gates and lets the sea flood in and flood his kingdom. Whereas with the city of Is, we get a kind of misogynistic, anti-pagan Christian look, undertones to the story. With this one, with Seithenyn, we don't. You can't really draw that same parallel, which leads me to believe that there is also much more to the city of Is myth as well. That outside of being a myth that is sort of leaden with Christian undertones, there is also much more to it as well. A lot of these stories that were featured in literature over the years came from past stories that were not written down. So who knows where some of these myths came from that weren't written down, whether they were ancestral memory or whether they were other bits of folklore that weren't so Christianized. It's hard to say, but it's interesting to think about, I think. So there are many similarities between these two myths, but there are also a lot of differences as well. One thing that drew me to the Cantref Gwaelod or Maes Gwyddno myth is that there are lots of shingle banks that look like man-made causeways in this area of Wales, and I love causeways now, because working on a tidal island, we have a causeway that connects the island to the mainland. So causeway is just a common part of my vocabulary at this point, and knowing about tides and the ocean is kind of part and parcel with that. And I love the idea that we have these shingle banks that look like man-made causeways, when in fact they're not. They are purely natural parts of the landscape that were created due to glaciers. You have lots of these types of shingle banks in this area of the world. You have San Gynffelyn as well. So there was a big kind of glacial movement that happened here. So when we think of glaciers, I don't know about you, but you often think of like big rocks and ice kind of tumbling down mountains. But of course a glacier is just a big mass of ice moving across land. So it was because of the last ice age, this movement of huge masses of ice have created this kind of unique
part of the landscape in this area of Wales. You have lots of different shingle banks that look like causeways, and a causeway obviously is a path. So it looks like a path is coming from the mainland, from the land, and down into the water. And that is such a significant and kind of romantic image. It's striking, that's the word I was looking for. It's such a striking image, a pathway going from the land and going into the water, because that truly lends itself to the imagination, doesn't it? You think, where is that a path to? Where is it going? What lies beneath the water? Is there a great city there? Is there a kingdom? And then coupled with the idea of church bells being heard underneath the water, it's fertile territory to create these kind of myths and legends surrounding sunken cities. And obviously, because of the nature of the sea itself, the fact that we have tides, the fact that the sea is not always at one stable level, the fact that it ebbs and flows, it moves up and down, that lends itself to myths and legends as well, because obviously at low tides, these causeways and banks will be more exposed than they are at high tides. So you have this kind of temporary feel to everything that has its own kind of magic to it, doesn't it? You know, one week you can walk in the same path and see a long bank and pathway ahead of you, and the next week you will see barely anything, and that is very kind of romantic and lovely as well, and again lends itself to these myths and legends about sunken lost cities. You can tell it's getting later because I started off quite coherent, and then I went and made myself a big bowl of pasta. And I thought, do I really want to do this? Because I'm going to go downstairs and make a meal, and then I'm going to eat it, and then I'm not going to be able to record the last bit of the podcast in the way that I want to. And then I thought, oh, well, I'm going to do it anyway. And so I did. But now I am quite full and just that little bit sleepy. So bear with me, because I'm still super excited to talk about this. I thought about pausing and then recording again tomorrow, but I thought, no, I'm really excited now. So we're just going to go with it. But in this myth, Sanbadrig, one of these causeways, is one of the dykes that protects the city or protects that kingdom. And I love that. It's one of my favourite things when distinctive parts of the natural landscape are used in myths and legends. You find that a lot in written myths and legends as well, especially in the Mabinogion. You get this idea that at one point these myths weren't always written down, or even if they were written down, they would have had to have been performed as well, because not everyone was literate. So you would have had people making references to distinct parts of the landscape as well. You know, we have always used the landscape to tell tales, to tell stories. We have always used the landscape as part of our folklore, as inspiration for our stories. Where you have large slabs of granite rock, you have giant myths. Where you have peninsulas and large bodies of water, or land that neighbours the sea, you have mermaid myths. Where you have hedges and woodland and moors, you have pixie myths. All of these myths and legends are married to the landscape inherently. And then we have other Welsh myths and legends like Llys Helig. So Llys Helig is a rock formation, again a standout part of the natural landscape that has been used in myths and legends and folklore for centuries. You know, the oldest mention of it being at the start of the 17th century in the Halliwell manuscript, but you have references to it being once a kingdom for 6th century kings. It's a rich kind of tapestry of folklore that surrounds these natural formations that pop out of the sea and make us think about what must be below, what could have been below. Because when you just look at the ocean, it's just the ocean. It's beautiful, but it's just the ocean. But when you see the ocean and you see a rock coming out of it, or you see a petrified forest a trunk of a petrified forest tree popping out of it, then that alights our imagination, that sets light to us then, and we have all of these ideas about what that rock could have been. Where I work at the moment, we have a rock called Chapel Rock, and there used to be a chapel on it, St. Catherine's Chapel. But there's lots of folklore surrounding Chapel Rock as well. One of the pieces of folklore is that Cormoran, the giant, I have talked about him in great length in my Cornish Giants episode, so I won't reiterate too much, but he knocks down his wife, and his wife drops the stones that she's carrying, and those form Chapel Rock. So these natural pieces of the landscape that have been formed by kind of scientific natural means, we have given mythic meaning, and I think that's beautiful. I think that's wonderful, and actually is quite a logical way of us explaining the world around us before we had the scientific knowledge to explain it. So I have two reasons for doing this particular episode. One, to kind of look at the interesting undertones that are buried beneath these stories in terms of morality and moral coding, but also in terms of the fact that, you know, as you can probably tell, I'm very interested in the idea of ancestral memory and in using the landscape in folklore. And I also think it's fascinating that most cultures around the world do tend to have flood myths. Now, I don't know if we have these flood myths for the same reason, but obviously because of the Ice Age, because of rising sea levels, it is a common and recurring natural kind of feature of the world that parts of the landscape are underneath the water where they once didn't used to be. And this idea of a flood in terms of a biblical myth is quite interesting as well, because I don't know if a lot of these stories, these Celtic stories especially, are biblical in nature to begin with. Obviously, when they're written down, they would have been written down in a time and an age where Christianity was the dominant religion. However, lots of these stories would have been taken from oral stories that were passed down through speech and through performance instead of the written word. And I have to wonder at the kind of religious aspect of those stories at that point. Because there are two ways of looking at the City of East, for example, in my mind anyway. You can look at it as this kind of religious look, like a moral tale at debauchery and decadence and what that will bring you. That will bring you ruin. You are to be punished for that. Or you can see the story of a sorceress, of a woman connected to the sea and in a way being misled by a lover and then being transformed into some kind of sea creature. And that doesn't seem like a punishment to me, really. You know, there's two different ways of seeing the same story, and you're going to get from it a different way of viewing it, I'm sure. We'll all be looking at these stories and taking different bits from them, what interests us most. Now, the idea of lost lands in particular, as I've said, is fertile territory for myths and legends. You know, these are places that are thought to have existed before recorded history, you know, and because of huge geological and natural changes to the world, we only have tiny little remnants of what once was. And like I said, when you see a rock coming out of the sea, or when you see a bit of wood or tree coming out of the sea, you know, your mind really goes to what happened before, what was before. And, you know, if it was a natural formation before, then why couldn't it be a human civilization before? Why couldn't there have been a town or a city or a society that was then engulfed by the sea? Because I love it because it's something that isn't 100% implausible. There is a grain of validity and a grain of kind of logic to these myths. You know, rising sea levels mean that there are parts of the land that have been engulfed by water. So what if there were towns and there were settlements? It makes sense to me that there would have been settlements on some of these pieces of land. Whether they would have been great, you know, technologically advanced cities, I don't know. I don't think so. But they could have been settlements in some kind of way. There could be town formations underneath the water, and one day we'll uncover some and think, oh, that's another sunken city we found. And I find that so exciting and brilliant. It kind of gives a bit of magic to the world, that there is still so much out there from the past that we just don't know about and that we're still finding. I've been reading a book recently which is really interesting. I think it's called Off the Road, and that has inclusion of phantom islands as well, and phantom lands, and that's different to lost lands, because a lost land is something that might once have existed or did exist that has now been lost beneath the water. But a phantom land is something that never actually existed in the first place. It was a kind of typo, a map typo from cartographers of the past, and it's only been remedied in modern times to think, oh, that actually never existed, that piece of land never existed. We just thought it did because it was constantly on different maps. And again, it's really romantic to think of not only of submerged basic settlements. We don't want our minds to go there, that's kind of boring. We want to think of great cities and palaces of kings of old with gold and jewellery and splendour. We want to think of treasure, hidden treasure buried underneath the sea. It's just, or within the sea. It's kind of human nature, isn't it, to see like a body of water and think what lies beneath, or to see anything, any clean slate or any kind of piece of landscape and think what was once there. I think that's great. I think it's brilliant that we have minds that are constantly searching for any type of magic in the world. Rockborough is a phantom island in Scottish myth that is said to appear 3 times to signal the end of the world. Lots of Irish myths kind of centre around the other world that are found in islands. There's no inundation myth, so it's different in the ones I'm talking about. But there are lots of Celtic myths that are associated with water and with kingdoms that are just outside of our kind of perspective, our knowledge. And the lost land of Lyonesse is really no different. You take pieces of folk memory, like I said, the flooding of Mounts Bay around St Michael's Mount, flooding what was once forest, and then you've got Arthurian legend with Tristan and Isolde, and Tristan being from a kind of mythical kingdom. You have all these different elements and ingredients that lend itself to the lost land of Lyonesse. And in kind of a Christian view of these stories is that they were like a Sodom and Gomorrah, like the Celtic equivalent of a Sodom and Gomorrah, and they were flooded due to debauchery and due to kind of anti-Christian behaviour. But in a kind of older look at it, they are just, like I said, they are just pieces of folk memory of what the landscape used to look like and now doesn't. The lost land of Lyonesse was the home kingdom of Tristan in Arthurian legend, and often in Arthurian legend it's kind of like a doomed place, a place that was doomed to be drowned. And what's so fascinating is that there has been pieces of evidence to link it to the Isles of Scilly, and to say that possibly there was a larger island at one point, and then because of rising sea levels it sunk beneath the water. Of course, the idea of a large cultural city with huge churches and church spires and church bells ringing beneath the water is very kind of a romantic extension of the myth. But the idea that there was land that is now being taken over by the sea is probably true. Who knows? I don't. I just love that people are constantly trying to know, trying to find out. You have mention of Lyonesse in Alfred Lord Tennyson's Ideals of the King. Then rose the king and moved his host by night, and ever pushed Sir Mordred league by league back to the sunset bound of Lyonesse, a land of old up heaven from the abyss, by fire to sink into the abyss again, where fragments of forgotten peoples dwelt, and the long mountains ended in a coast of ever shifting sand, and far away the phantom cycle of a moaning sea. I mean, isn't that just gorgeous? Isn't that just so wonderfully romantic and brilliant? This idea of shifting sands and changing tides and a lost people and a lost land. That's what I love most about the idea of Lost Lands, the inherent romanticism in it. And like I said, the idea that it lends a kind of magic to the world. And on that note, folks, I think I'm done for the night. Hopefully you've enjoyed this experience with me. It feels like it's been an experience. I've definitely really enjoyed this episode. I've done lots of kind of reading on this topic. As one reviewer once put, this show is more off the cuff than scripted. You could not be more correct. I don't script it. I never have, really. I have vague notes that I look at. I try and research a lot and then take notes and then kind of work from those notes. But really, I just like to have a chat with you all. I just like to have a little chat with my microphone and pretend you're all my friends sat in a nice big room having a chat back at me. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. And again, you can find this podcast on Twitter, on Facebook. You can give me an email, please. Rate and review on iTunes or whatever other podcast platform you use. It's really helpful, it really helps me, and it's really lovely as well. I definitely want to start spending some more time on this podcast. As you can see, this episode is almost an hour long. It might be my longest episode yet. I never want to do too long episodes though, because I know from personal experience that my attention span is terrible. So I don't know about anyone else, but sometimes it takes me a while to listen to longer podcasts because I have to stop and start them. So this was a really fun day, a really fun way to spend my one day off a week. I only get Mondays off, so today is Monday. And I really did want to work on this podcast. People are being so supportive of me recently, and I think this is where my love lies, and people are interested in Celtic myths and legends. There's a niche for it. So I'm happy that I have found my people, and I can throw out all these Celtic myths and legends at you. So I hope you all have a lovely, wonderful evening or morning. I don't know what the time zones are like where you are, but I'm going to go to bed now, I think. Good night.